Welcome to Aurora Connect. This is season 4, episode 7 for Friday, February 18th, 2022. Nobel Prize-winning author Daniel Kahneman and special guest Jonathan Spector. I'm Associate Artistic Director Dawn Monique Williams, and as always, I'm joined by Josh Costello, Aurora Theater's Artistic Director. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Dawn. I'm at home today instead of in the office, so we'll see how my internet holds up for this episode.
Okay, sounds good to me. Hopefully you'll hang in there till the end. Otherwise, I'll probably be a little too gobsmacked to proceed without you. But to our viewers, I do want to let you know this is a pre-recorded episode, so feel free to drop comments in the chat. I will be monitoring, but we won't be able to ask the Dr. Jonathan any questions live as this is a pre-record. So you can also email us, as always, at connects@auroratheater.org. That's connects@auroratheater.org. We love hearing from you.
All right, and we have 2 more shows lined up for this for the rest of this season, as well as the rescheduled production of This Much I Know, which we'll be talking about today. We had to reschedule this production because of Omicron, but it is going to happen in September, and subscribers still have tickets, and tickets are going to be available for everybody else as well for This Much I Know in September. But coming up first, we have the world premiere of our commissioned play from Cleavon Smith, The Incrementalist, which Dawn is directing, and a play called Wives by Jacqueline Backhouse, which is a really fantastic story, a lot of fun as well. So we hope that you will join us for those productions and subscribe. You can go to our website at auroratheater.org to find out more. And while you're there, if you are so inclined, you can press the donate button at the top right and help us get through this continuing difficult time. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, without further delay, Josh, why don't we get our guests in here?
All right. Daniel Kahneman, thank you so much for joining us. And we have Jonathan Spector, our playwright of Eureka Day as well. Daniel Kahneman is a professor of psychology and public affairs emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School, the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Princeton University, and a fellow of the Center for Rationality at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has been a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University, the University of British Columbia, and right here at UC Berkeley. And his many awards include the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences and the Lifetime Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I highly recommend, was a major inspiration for our other guest, playwright Jonathan Spector, and his play This Much I Know, which will be having its world premiere, as I mentioned, at Aurora this September. Aurora audiences know Jonathan from Eureka Day, which went on from its Aurora premiere to become a hit production in New York. Jonathan is the artistic director of Just Theater and a member of Aurora's advisory council. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Sure.
So I want to start by asking this, Dr. Kahneman, am I understanding correctly that you won the Nobel Prize, that you're a psychologist, but you won the Nobel Prize in economics, and it was for disproving the idea that people act out of rational self-interest? Do I have that right?
Not quite, no.
Okay.
Set us straight.
But my late colleague, Amos Tversky, and I published some work on judgment and on decision-making, which sort of challenged one of the assumptions of economic theory. The assumption is called the rationality assumption, but it's actually a very technical definition, the rationality, and it's completely infeasible. It means that all your beliefs are consistent, all your preferences are consistent. So it clearly, rationality as defined mathematically in economics and in decision theory is just not a plausible psychological model at all. I mean, no finite mind can be rational by that definition. So we've been described very often as sort of prophets of irrationality, which is completely wrong. But we did challenge some assumptions of the standard economic model.
All right. Well, I'm sticking to my story then. But Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about how Dr. Kahneman's ideas inspired you to write This Much I Know?
Sure. I had read Thinking Fast and Slow some years ago. I don't remember exactly when, but I was struck by a couple of things that made me think there might be some juice in it for for a play. One was the feeling I had while reading it when you would describe these experiments and sort of cognitive errors that we make, and you can, as you're reading the book, you can feel yourself sort of making these same mistakes. And that kind of, there was something that struck me as very theatrical about that kind of engagement with the text. And so that was one piece. And then the other was this idea that, the language of rehearsing plays, of making theater, we talk about, what does the character want and what do they do to get the thing they want, and very much the sort of analysis of how characters act in plays is very rational, as though they're all sort of rationally going about pursuing the things they want. But this book is, so much about how many of the things we choose to do and, are, we don't proceed along that sort of like ABC movement through the world. And then I guess the third piece is, and I'd be curious to hear what you think on this, but I something about the same way that this sort of associative thinking, decision making, where we're making connections that don't exist between two things, that can lead us to make sort of mistakes in a rational sense, is also where creativity comes from. It's often, like when you have an idea for a creative project, it's because of the collision of two things that don't naturally go together, but somehow you have this feeling that maybe they do, and that leads to some third thing. So I think all of, trying to then figure out how to what to do with all of those questions and ideas, I think was the sort of jumping off point for the play.
Well, it was actually quite gratifying to read the play and to recognize some of the themes of the book in the play. One of the important themes in the book, which recurs in the play, and you made beautiful use of it, I thought, was the idea that there's a lot of what we think and of what we decide that isn't an action on our part. It's not something we do, it's something that happens to us. And that idea recurs in your play in several places, and with its implications for personal responsibility. And so I thought it was very richly used in the play. It was, from that, quite pleasant for an author to recognize. And there were other themes that I recognized, and where you were creative in creating new examples and new associations from material that had been there. Like, I think there is something about peaches and maggots and the feeling that they arouse, which is similar to something that I had said, but not the same, and interestingly different. So this was fun to read. And the parts that I didn't recognize were also fun to read, but were not nearly as familiar.
Yeah, a lot of ideas in this play. Can we drill down into one of these ideas a little bit? This idea of something that happens to us rather than something we decide, and how that works psychologically. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how that plays out? Are you asking
me, or are you asking Jonathan?
Let's ask you, Dr. Kahneman. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I draw that distinction between two ways in which ideas come to mind. And so the example that I build a lot on is when you hear 2 + 2, a number comes to your mind. And when you hear your mother, an emotion arises. In in both instances, it's really not something you do. It is something that happens to you. You're almost passive, and it's a thought that imposes itself on you. But there are other thoughts that we generate with some effort. Sometimes we search our memory effortfully and deliberately. Sometimes we develop a line of reasoning or a computation. And those are things that we do. They don't happen by themselves. We do them. They require effort, and they have a completely different feeling to them, I think. So that was the distinction. It was really quite basic to, it's a basic theme in the book.
Yeah, the thinking fast and the thinking slow, and the system 1 and system 2.
That's right. Thinking fast is what we talked about. Now, with respect to creativity, and it's absolutely true that I described a lot of what is happening in system 1 really in terms of associative memory. So associations come to your mind, you don't search for them, they really happen to you. And this is also said about intuitions. Intuitions are thought that come to your mind with a great deal of confidence, and you don't know where they come from. That is, it's almost the definition of intuition, that you think you know something without knowing why you think you know it. I have, by the way, modified the standard definition of intuition, that you know something without knowing why you know it. But that's not right, because that would mean that all intuitions are correct. But no, you think you know things. That's intuition, and quite often intuitions are right, and you do know them. And quite often intuitions are wrong, and you just think you know it, but you don't.
I
And there's very
just
little.
listened to a talk that you did on intuition, and I'm one of these new age people that everything I do is focused on like getting deeper and deeper and deeper into tapping into intuition. And I was really fascinated to hear you say that it's not that we don't tap into intuition, but that we take it slow so that it becomes one of these slow processes. And I wonder, just I'm not a science person at all, but I just wonder what that connection you think is between like the gut brain and intuition.
Well, both of these notions are pretty vague, and they refer pretty much to the same thing. I mean, it's to a thought, something really that happens to you. It's a thought about the world. We talk about intuition when you have that powerful sense of knowing something, and you're quite sure that you know it, and yet you find it difficult to articulate, why you think that. And I don't quite know what you're referring to that you heard me say, but it's true that in my recent thinking, and I wrote a book with 2 co-authors last year called Noise, and in that book we developed the idea that when you are trying to solve a problem, when you're trying to make a decision, you should try to delay intuition. So it's not, the problem with intuition is that it's very quick. It's fast thinking. And it uses typically very little information. That's part of why we call it intuition. That's part of the miracle of it. It seems to happen so fast. But there is another aspect to intuition. There's a sort of confidence that you have that you know it. And our idea is, to the extent possible, try to accumulate information without jumping to a conclusion, to a general conclusion about whether you like this thing or you approve of this candidate or something of that nature. Delaying intuition will make intuition more valid. That is a theme in the current thinking.
How do you delay intuition?
Well, individual, the best example, and actually it's a key example in our treatment of it, is how you interview candidates for a job. And the standard way of interviewing candidates is you talk to them and you try to form an impression of what they're like. and whether you like them and whether you think they can do the job, and that develops gradually. Now it turns out we call that an unstructured interview because it happens. But we know about the unstructured interview actually that intuition is very fast. So people form an impression of what their final conclusion is going to be within the first 2 or 3 minutes of the interview. And then they spend the rest of the time justifying that intuition. There is an alternative to this, which is called a structured interview. And in the structured interview, you have, say, attributes of a person that you're looking for to perform a job adequately. And you query and you investigate one attribute at a time. And you make a judgment about each attribute separately and independently from all the others. So you're trying not to form a global impression. You're trying to form narrow impressions. And at the end, when you have all these narrow impressions, now is the time to put them together and to have an intuition. So by focusing your attention on, by not trying to reach a conclusion quickly, but on the contrary, by focusing your attention on one aspect of the problem at a time, you are delaying intuition. So that's the idea. It's a hard thing to do for an individual, but it's an easier thing to sort of regulate for an organization, because organizations make judgments and they make decisions, and organizations think slowly. And so you have an opportunity to intervene and to set up procedures and to enforce the sequential investigation of separate aspects of the problem, and to delay, for example, specifically if you run a meeting and somebody wants to jump to the conclusion and wants to express how they're going to vote at the end of the hour, you really don't let them. You try to prevent that because you don't want people to form a global impression until they have a lot more information. So that's the way intuition might work, we hope.
It's so fascinating because we are in the very final stages of our search for a new managing director who will be my co-equal partner in leadership position in the organization. And we hired a search firm to help us with it. And they instituted exactly what you're talking about. They said from the beginning, before we announce the search, let's identify like the 5 or 6 key qualities that we are looking for, key competencies that we're looking for in this person. And then let's develop questions that specifically address each of those competencies. And then let's ask the same questions in the same order to each candidate so that we can really be evaluating it that way. And a lot of that was specifically to avoid or to I don't know, counter or balance out any kind of implicit bias that we might have as questioners or that the board might have as questioners, so that there may be somebody who we immediately just sort of feel like we have a connection with, but we don't want that to guide the whole rest of the process. Yeah, it's bias, it's rapid intuition, and it's what we call the halo effect. That is that when you form an impression of one aspect of the personality and say it's favorable, then everything is favorable. So if you like that person, you assume that they're generous, but in fact, they may be quite not generous at all. You don't know whether they're generous or not. All you know is you like them, and then the rest follows. So that's how intuition goes wrong. It's through the halo effect.
Yeah, I mean, since reading your work, I find myself thinking all the time about this in when auditioning actors for parts, because you will see an actor and then whoever is in the room will discuss that person. And I'm very aware of, and I don't quite know how to stop it, that much of what the discussion is trying to justify your intuition about the person rather than actually being able to sort of discuss the attributes of that person in a kind of objective way. Or
I mean, I think that selecting an actor must be quite difficult because in those terms. That is, structuring the process of selecting an actor is difficult because I don't even know whether you have a list of attributes that you can apply. I mean, this must be different for every role, and there must be many subtle things. So it would be a real challenge to do that differently. But maybe we also know that in some cases and in some types of judgment, you should trust your intuition. And this may be one of them. But so, I mean, you are watching an audition, so the actor is doing something. And hopefully the actor is doing something that is similar to something they'll be called upon to do for that particular role. And so the sense that you have of whether this is going well, this feels natural, this feels true, that may be quite valid. And it may be the best that you can do. It's a very interesting question, actually. I hadn't thought of that, but certainly there are cases like this one where for an actor, selecting an actor, that's hard. Where I find this kind of judgment more objectionable is theater critics.
You're talking to the right group.
Yeah, I'm sure. They when had the impression that they liked or didn't like the play, and then it's mostly what they liked, with a few qualifications or a list of what they disliked, and saying this actor was not too bad or something like that. That really bothers me because as a critic, for a critic of a play, there should be dimensions. There should be attributes that you could think about one at a time. And you don't have to write it that way, but to just make a judgment because you feel that way, I think feels more appropriate in selecting an actor than in judging a play. You'll probably agree with me.
Yes, although that connects to another thing that shows up in the play a bit, and that your work has made me think a lot about, of how we, we remember most strongly the beginnings of things and peak experiences. And so probably if you want the critics to remember your play fondly, the beginning of the play, I guess, is much more important than we even give it.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, slow beginnings are hard to recover from. I think that's if one had the impression this isn't going anywhere. Sometimes you get surprised in the third act, but you never fully recover, even if it begins to make sense. When it begins to make sense too late, you're not going to love the play quite as much as you would if you were gripped from the beginning.
One of the ideas in the book that I find really compelling is the way all of these ideas are connected by the idea that this fast part of our brain is designed to come up with plausible scenarios. In other words, to create narrative, right? To create a story that makes sense. And that's so much of how we understand the world, is this unconscious, non-effortful work of the fast part of our brain, and how that connects to feelings about responsibility and grief is something that Jonathan really explores. There's a quote from your book that really stood out to me. The mind that makes up narratives about the past is a sense-making organ. That we want to make sense out of things rather than accept that things can happen randomly or without meaning behind them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's pretty clear. A lot of what happens when we understand things is it happens retroactively. That is, you understand things later. Put it that way. Something happens, and then later something else happens that you can tie to what happened earlier in and make a good story out of. And really, that's the way the mind works. The mind works when there is an event that is unexpected. The mind automatically seems to search for a cause. So it looks in the recent past for a cause. In Thinking Fast and Slow, I was quoting a nice story that I heard from Nassim Taleb, and which was on the day that Saddam Hussein was caught. Something happened on the market. I don't know, the market went up or went down. And the story was on Bloomberg, I think, there was a headline, stocks are up and Hussein's capture made people hopeful. And, an hour later, stocks were down. And it said stocks are down and Hussein's capture made people worried. And so clearly, it couldn't do both. I mean, but in both cases, there was a story. The combination of the stories makes it absurd. But this is the way we think. That is, there is an event and we look for its cause in the recent past. We look for ways of creating a narrative. And I emphasize the retroactive part of it because people often get confused between, they think that the mind works by expecting things. And what I emphasize is it's not so much that you expect things, that's mostly you're not surprised. And not being surprised is not the same thing as having expected what happens, because not being surprised means that you can easily make sense of it when it happens. It's not that you precisely predicted. You don't know what the next sentence that I'm going to be is, but you'd be very surprised if all of a sudden, I was talking about my dog, because that would be surprising. But almost anything that I can say in the context of play, psychology, fast, slow thinking, you'll make sense of it as it happens by linking it to the past. So this construction of narratives is really an interesting process.
And Jonathan, you really play with that in the play in a couple of different ways. And I know, and one thing that we've talked about in our discussions of the play is that one of your ideas was not just to explore some of Dr. Kahneman's ideas within the text of the play, within the story of the play, but also with the structure of how the play works and sets up expectations for the audience, and then perhaps subverts those expectations, and sort of using these ideas in the way the play operates itself and not just in the content. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the other sort of inspiration point for the play was this British company called Complicité that makes often has plays where they will have a sort of very heady idea at the center of it, like the way memory works, or sort of higher math, and then they will find a way to sort of theatricalize that idea and get you to kind of experience it as an audience member. And so that was sort of part of the challenge, was to see if I could do something like that. And I guess the hope in the way the play is constructed, and we will find out when we have an audience in, knock on wood, in September, is to, by the sort of initially laying out some of these ideas for the audience, and then stacking different things on top of each other, that there will be inviting the audience to sort of bring a bit of an awareness to the connections that you are, the sort of associative connections you're making between these different stories, some of which are intentional and you're being pointed to, and some of which you're maybe sort of being left to arrive at on your own, and hopefully at different points kind of question some of those.
Could you give an example?
Sure. I think when we first encounter, Svetlana, this Joseph Stalin's daughter, it comes just after a scene of having seen Natalia, who and there's some and we are sort of set up a little bit to assume that this must be her grandmother because there was a reference to her grandmother earlier, and then we later discover that's not the case. But we immediately, our desire as people making story is to immediately kind of connect everything together and assume everything we're encountering, has a sort of direct connection, and then we have to be sort of backed out of that and see the more indirect connections between things, as well as just sort of thematically, being invited to, the project of the play as a whole, being invited to sort of contemplate the ways in which the situation that Svetlana is in, is or is not the same as the situation that Harold is in, as the situation that Natalia is in, as all things that, some piece of them are not their responsibility, and then, but, and some piece of them are, and trying to sort of understand how those things are and are not the same.
Yeah, it's most acute with respect to Natalia, and they have the theme of undoing and of accepting responsibility, that in fact of feeling a responsibility that somehow you really don't have, or you shouldn't feel. But I think you have a nice phrase there that I'm not going to remember the exact wording, but the idea that she expresses is that this is something that sticks to her. The guilt, or the sense that she was the cause of the accident, that it sticks. And I thought that image, I thought it was quite powerful.
Right. I mean, that's another idea that I wanted to dig into, and it's so interesting is certainly in her situation, somebody who is, who accidentally kills someone in an accident, that the disconnect between the idea that it is obviously something you did, in the sense that you, the sort of corporeal body of a person, was driving the car, but it's not something in the way that we think about the way we do things, as with choice and intention. It's not something you did in that sense. So trying to understand where you fall between those things as a person.
Well, and the difference between the two parts of your brain in doing that, right? Because the first part of your brain is going to construct a story in that makes it be your fault, like that like it doesn't make sense that it would just be random. But then the other part of the brain can maybe see that, well, everybody's saying it was an accident, the police say it was an accident, like nobody, like it definitely, there was no intention there, and there was nothing I could have done to avoid it. But that doesn't entirely address the feeling that the first part of the brain has come up with, that there must be some culpability there.
I mean, there is, as Natalia says in the play, if she had left home 2 minutes later or earlier, it would have happened. So it's the ease with which you can undo the event by an action that you could have taken by doing something else. That is very easy to imagine. And if it's easy to imagine, it will inevitably cause a sense, produce a sense of causation, of the causal, and produce some guilt. I chose when to leave. And, if I had made a different choice, that person would still be alive. I mean, this can be quite painful, although in a way it's absurd because you couldn't have known, but you chose, and it had consequences.
Josh, I have a question for you in unpacking all of this. I know for me as a director, I have gotten so accustomed to just being like, I just have a hunch. I just go on my hunch. And so I'm wondering, in this sort of meta way, how reading Dr. Kahneman's book is informing your approach to the text as a
Mhm.
director, but also from like inside the world building. Does the question make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think I have a couple different ways I want to answer it. One is that I always, as far as like directing process and hunches go, is I try to always pay attention to my hunches, because I've done this a lot, and often my hunches are based on experience, even if I can't name it directly. But also, I spend a lot of time on text analysis, and the more that what Dr. Kahneman would call system 2 in my brain, the system that is effortful. And I spend a lot of time going over given circumstances, looking at the structure of the play, really trying to create an analytical framework for how the story works. And then I compare that to my hunches, right? And sometimes, and even throughout the process, maybe something will happen in rehearsal that goes against this framework that I've developed. And then the question becomes, do I listen to my hunch, in which case I need to revise my framework and maybe come up with something more useful? Or do I say, you know what, that hunch is interesting, but it doesn't create a better framework. And so, in fact, there are lots of other interesting things we could do, and that hunch is going to go away for now. And sometimes you don't know right away, right? You have to sort of play with it and have the actors try it a certain way. But I do like that interplay between what I'm calling analysis and what I'm calling a hunch, analysis and intuition. I think that's proven very fruitful for me in terms of making decisions during a rehearsal process and during a design process. Yeah, I was going to say something else and I've lost the thread on that one. What was the other part of your question? There was something else.
Well, there's the like how this book as a source material for the playwright, how that informs the world of the play would be like the second part of there's the meta question, which you responded to, but then it's just how is this book as an inspiration to the play going to inform?
Well, it definitely helps clarify a lot of the ideas in the play for me, that I sort of can see, having read the book, I can read the play again and sort of see where Jonathan is connecting the dots, or is asking us to connect the dots, or is using the ideas of the book both structurally and explicitly. But then also, the character of Lukesh, the play is centered around, in many ways, this character Lukesh, who is our guide into the play, because he is a lecturer in psychology who's giving lectures on many of the ideas in the book. And they're extremely, he's a very charismatic lecturer, and he's delivering these ideas in a really compelling way. And so reading about these ideas helps me understand that character and his own inability to distinguish between intuition and analysis, or what true causality is, and what his failure to recognize that despite all his rigorous analysis, there is another side to it, is one of the central themes of the play. One of the central actions of the play is him coping with his own failure to be there for his wife emotionally, because he thought that what she needed to hear was that it's not your fault, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. But what she needed was, like you said, Dr. Kahneman, that this was something that, even if it's not her fault, it sticks with her. It's part of who she is now. And the psychologist, failed to fully internalize that, and failed to interact with her in a way that would be useful given that. And so, as always with research, it's like it's always helpful to have the context for what the play is about, and to be able to talk to the actors about why their characters make certain decisions. And all of this is about decision making, right? Ultimately, it's about decision making, and that's as Jonathan was saying, that's like a key thing in staging a play, is that you're looking at, my character makes a decision at this point. What went into that decision? How do I play making that decision and then going off on a different course of action? That's sort of the granular text of the play. Ultimately, other than the language itself, is the decision points, and anything that informs those decision points is tremendously useful.
I find myself in a situation that in a way, I've wished for a long time, because I've for a long time been curious about the play and the director, the playwright and the director. And I had actually never been that close to a playwright and the director. So clearly you have your vision. You're making the play happen as a director. And you are listening to that. And if that probably is not exactly your vision. Right? I mean, it's something I've been very curious about for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite, yes, it's quite a strange thing, because I think I think each collaboration is different, and you sort of have a different job. And I mean, I have been a director before, and I've never directed my own work. And I think I, at least at this point, have no desire to, because I think that, the kind of things I am very focused on as the writer are a different set of things than the director necessarily needs to be focused on. And Josh and I have worked together before, and I trust him and know that he understands my work. Though there will no doubt be moments in rehearsal where I pull him aside and say, "Oh, I don't think that's really what that moment is about." And
But he is still free to interpret it, isn't he? Or are you still? Do you still own it?
That's a good. I mean, I think legally I own it, but and I think it. This will be the first production of the play, so I think because of that, there is more of a sense that it's important to try and translate sort of what my intention was, because then we can see if it works or not. Whereas I think with a play that goes on to have subsequent productions, as the playwright, you can feel more free to kind of let people make different choices and kind of see what they do with it. And there may also, and certainly will be moments where I may feel very strongly that I think something should be a certain way, and Josh has a different point of view. And then when I see his version, I realize, no, he's actually right, and that's much better, and let's do it that way.
Yeah, so it's not automatic that when I was asking whether you own it, that would mean that you can, if you tell the director, this is what I meant, that he has to do it that way. He doesn't, does he? Well, I mean,
it depends. I mean, we have to follow the script. We sign a licensing agreement, and if it's written in the script, we can't change the dialogue, for example. And then the stage directions are a little bit murkier, but we're supposed to follow the stage directions as well. But the thing is, it doesn't get to that point, right? Usually it's, because we have such a strong relationship and we've done this before, and because we spend so much time beforehand talking about the play and talking about, going out for beers and just talking through ideas. We have a dramaturg that'll help us talk through it as well. We try to really get on as close as we can to the same page before rehearsal start. And then there's so many opportunities within that of the process of where we're bringing in the scenic designer and the lighting designer and the sound designer and the projections designer, and I have to sort of give them a framework for what we're looking for and what we're doing and how we're thinking about the play. And Jonathan is in the room hearing me say that, and then often afterwards he'll be like, when you said this one thing, I don't think that's quite right. And then the next time out, I'll have a different, and I'll spend time thinking about that, and we'll talk it over. It's so much fun. Dawn, you and I were just talking about this with Cleavon's play about how much fun it is for a director to be part of the creation of a new play, because so often we're just handed a script and the playwright's not around, or it's a classic play and the playwright's been dead for 400 years. But that collaboration, I think, is so fruitful and leads to work that I think is really strong.
And also the play, as in a play that's never been produced, the text is kind of a theory, and then when you have living people in the room saying those words, then you see if you were right or not in your theory, and maybe you sort of make you have to make adjustments to if you were wrong to try and find the truth, whatever it is.
Thank you. I really wanted to understand that better. So this has been very useful to me. But
I would love to ask one other question. It's a little bit left field, but something I've been thinking about a lot in these past 2 years, which I feel like so much of your work is about how bad humans are at sort of analyzing statistics and risk analysis. And I feel like every individual that I know has spent the last 2 years every day trying to analyze statistics and do their own personal risk analysis and figure out, when am I going to eat inside in a restaurant or go on an airplane or see friends. And which I'm no doubt we're all doing terribly. And I'm curious if there's anything that has sort of surprised you about watching the world, do that in such a collective way for 2 years.
Well, I mean, actually the thing that surprised me is in the extent to which there were large differences among people in their interpretation of the situation. And those had a lot to do with just emotion. I mean, among the people I know, some were afraid and others were not afraid. And, it's that simple, really. The rest, they justified by all sorts of things, but the emotion were there first. And there were really vast differences in people's emotions.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Dr. Kahneman, for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Thank
you. I'm glad to meet you.
Yeah,
our pleasure. Thank you so much.
And Jonathan, thank you as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, and I leave it on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Kahneman. All right. That was a fun episode, Dawn.
Yes. That was great. That was really great.
Yeah.
How fancy are we?
A couple of
Nobel
things.
Prize-winning.
I know. So I want to let everybody know about the Rafael House of San Francisco. We like to give a shout out to an organization in our community that's doing good work, and Rafael House is doing great work. Since 1971, they have been at the forefront of providing homeless and low-income families in the San Francisco Bay Area the personalized, family-centered solutions they need to build brighter futures. Rafael House is a 100% privately funded and community-supported organization. Their success rate is unmatched. More than 85% of all Rafael House families go on to achieve long-term housing and financial stability. So please check them out.
Great. And again, we love hearing from folks. So we encourage folks to drop us an email at connects@auroratheater.org, connects@auroratheater.org. We are continuing with season 4 here, but we are thinking ahead to season 5.
Yeah, and as always, you can subscribe to Aurora Theater Company at auroratheater.org. We have 2 more plays plus This Much I Know and its rescheduled slot in September coming up, and we'd love for you to check it out, auroratheater.org. And while you're there, you can click the donate button at the top right and give us a little hand.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching, and thanks for staying connected.